The National Center for Disease Control is reporting more cases of two rare and deadly diseases found in homosexual men. There is no apparent explanation for the outbreak.
Obviously, this is an issue with great emotional fervor, but...
How can we stay unemotional when people are dying every day from a disease the CDC has yet to name? For crying out loud, if the CDC won't name it, at least demand the press stop calling it GRID.
Well, unfortunately, I have to take credit for coining the term GRID, which stood for gay-related immune deficiency. We were seeing a cluster of gay men who were suddenly critically ill of pneumocystis pneumonia, which was the indicator disease of something new, and reported our findings to the CDC.
I was the chief of the STD division at the CDC at that time when the draft report of 5 cases of pneumocystis in gay men came across my desk for review. Shortly afterward, cases of a very rare cancer called Kaposi sarcoma were diagnosed in young gay men. My first reaction was, this is an extraordinarily important finding.
The CDC was looking for something like that when it came along. They were looking for it already. They were hoping there was going to be a new plague because polio was over. The CDC's budget was getting decreased. This is back in like the early 80s.
There was double-digit inflation, a very high unemployment, a rapid military buildup, and a threat to decrease all domestic programs. And this led to reductions in force in the public health service, particularly the CDC.
The Center of Disease Control, CDC, in Atlanta was under threat for reduction and even theoretically for closure.
There were memos around the CDC that says, we need to find a new plague.
For them to justify their expenses and their existence and make their careers, they have to find infectious diseases.
We need to find something that'll scare the American people so they won't give us more money.
Once people recognized that this was likely caused by a virus, the media attention went from no news coverage to the most covered news story in history. People went from neglecting it to fear and panic. Maybe I can get it.
All of a sudden, AIDS was a very fundable project, and I suppose the psychology they worked on was the fact that they thought, well, in Congress, essentially this is white, straight, heterosexual men who are the congressmen, and if they feel they can't fuck around without being worried about AIDS, they're going to let the dollars out. And it worked.
Suddenly there was a lot of money available for anybody who wanted to study HIV. And nobody ever looked back and said, why do we want to study HIV? Bob Gallo said on television, causes AIDS.
The evidence shows that this disease is not merely confined to the gay community. I motion to call the disease Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, AIDS.
There are other ways you could produce a condition that looks like AIDS, but they too will be some source that causes a severe defect in the immune response.
19 million Americans now, 19 million, are taking illicit drugs every day. But we don't talk about this. This is politically incorrect.
There have been a number of theories as to what the origin of HIV/AIDS is. One of them was a theory that certainly turned out to be completely incorrect, that it's a lifestyle phenomenon.
There's a large epidemic of STDs in general in the late 70s, and particularly in gay men. In San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles were meccas of the new lifestyle, which came from the liberation in the post-Stonewall era.
The more partners you could have, the more you were striking a blow for gay lib. I remember talking to one of the people who was at the forefront of that lifestyle. It very much felt like if he did have another bout of syphilis or gonorrhea, whatever it might be, that it was like a notch, a victory notched up for his right to exist as a gay man.
I went on a vacation to Los Angeles, and it wasn't that wild, but one night I went to a bathhouse. I came home with, get this, at the same time syphilis, gonorrhea, and 2 forms of parasites.
I have no views about that, you know, in a judgmental kind of sense, but certainly from a public health point of view, that's kind of a prescription for disaster, because AIDS first occurred in these men who were not healthy for reasons that were obvious to everyone.
You're talking thousands of partners, sometimes hundreds, you know, per month, lots of antibiotic use, lots of drug use, and you know, the result were people were getting pretty sick.
There's a drug called amyl nitrate that was developed in the 1850s and 60s. Came in ampules, and they became known as poppers because you'd pop them when you open these ampules up to sniff them when you had coronary artery disease. The first AIDS cases, for example, that Mike Gottlieb reported were all 5 gay men. They were young. They all used poppers.
Poppers, something you walk around huffing all night. I mean, it says flammable, fatal if swallowed on the side of the bottle. They're walking around huffing it all night long. Why? Gives you a great rush.
Poppers was a sex drug. They were in every gay bathhouse, every bar, every porno bookstore across the nation. Poppers were visible on the dance floor in the discos. At the end of an evening, the bartender would announce last call for alcohol, last call for poppers.
It was like a mad, wonderful kind of a dance that was being done. But if you think that can happen forever, you're wrong.
Whether or not HIV exists, whether its role in a weakened immune system is almost irrelevant when you compare it to what was going on at that time.
The lifestyle explanation proved politically unacceptable, but the virus explanation proved very, very acceptable to many different parties.
Pneumocystis pneumonia and Kaposi's sarcoma were the hallmark diseases for AIDS in the early years.
To go back and deconstruct it and say, what exactly did cause pneumocystis carinea?
I remember the first patient that I ever saw, my resident brought me to see a young gay man with pneumocystis pneumonia. I knew a little bit about the use of poppers or amyl nitrite inhalants, and I started asking the patient if he used them, and it turned out that he was a very heavy user of amyl nitrites, and much to the surprise of my students, I said, I think the man probably has destroyed his pulmonary immune system by inhaling this toxin.
What exactly caused Kaposi's sarcoma? We know that now. It was amyl nitrite.
We saw KS decline, interestingly parallel to the decline in popper use.
We now know that Kaposi's sarcoma is caused by a second virus, the human herpes virus, strain 8.
To rescue comes another virus. As always, when you're in trouble, you find another virus.
If one wants to look at really what causes this, we've got to look beyond just HIV and just beyond HHV-8.
Calling it a disease, see? And to give it that name, AIDS. So everything's included under that, and you don't have to just say, I mean, if you just said, you know, these people are getting a lot of weird diseases, all kinds of diseases, it wouldn't have had the same impact. It was much better to say, there is an infectious organism on the loose in America, and it could get you.
I had interviewed the world's leading HIV experts and discovered that the 2 benchmark diseases of AIDS have alternate explanations. Once again, I turned to Dr. Gelderblum, seeking proof of HIV's existence in the most recent images available.
Here, you do not see anything about the details, but I would say it's probably a virus.
These are HIV here?
Yeah.
Oh, so are these HIV too?
Yeah, yeah.
Everything's
Probably.
Probably.
Yeah.
What can I tell you? You know, I mean, it exists.
Gallo said he had all these viruses, and it was a lie.
I think HIV totally has turned out not to be the cause of AIDS. HIV has turned out not to be.
Gelderblum's images, said to come from isolated HIV cultures, provided no proof for HIV's existence. So I asked Nobel laureate Dr. David Baltimore and Dr. Robin Weiss how they would isolate and photograph this elusive virus.
Well, didn't Dr. Gallo do that? I mean, he actually isolated it, so... Yeah. I mean, why should I do all of this? This is all textbook stuff you're asking me.
I'm not quite sure what's behind your question about isolation.
I don't want to be your textbook, you know? Okay. I got other things to do.
They're embarrassed. The scientists have been embarrassed about this. They know that it's flawed.
In 1987, the CDC made two mind-boggling changes in the definition of AIDS, which are in effect today. You can be diagnosed with AIDS without ever having an HIV test.
In 1987, I had a lesion on my arm, and it was KS, Kaposi sarcoma.
The doctor diagnosed you with AIDS without an HIV test?
Yeah.
You can be diagnosed with AIDS if you've tested negative for HIV.
Alvin Friedman Keene found 16 patients with Kaposi sarcoma among gay men in New York City in the 80s. They did not have HIV infection. Yet they had AIDS by our definition, right?
In a World Health Organization publication, Dr. Chin writes, "It should be emphasized that the surveillance definitions for AIDS were not intended to be reliable indicators of HIV infection."
If you have thousands of documented cases of AIDS without HIV, how can HIV cause AIDS?
Why do you believe that HIV does cause AIDS?
Because that's all the information that I've been given.
Because we've never been taught anything different.
We have read it, heard it.
Because that's what the scientific community has told us.
Scientists are supposed to observe, experiment, and reason from what they observe. They're not supposed to grab hold of an idea and cling to it and adjust everything else in their perceptions to fit that idea.
To understand just how HIV became the target of this international war on AIDS, we have to look back at how it all began. What set into motion the chain of events that many say misled objective science? Following the Depression of the 30s and World War II, America emerged into a new era of technology and prosperity. We had more time for recreation and self-realization. Society began to change. Medical science had new breakthroughs. We conquered polio, the last great infectious epidemic of the modern world. Soon, new antibiotics cured everything from minor infections to venereal disease. With the invention of the birth control pill came the sexual revolution, freeing the public from age-old fears and taboos. Homosexuality, too, found more freedom of expression as gays came out of the closet and formed their own subculture. During the Vietnam era of the 60s, recreational drug use skyrocketed among the young and would continue to grow. Yet, we remained optimistic that we could solve all our problems through our new faith in science and technology. But before long, the unforeseen consequences of this new liberated lifestyle began to rear its ugly head. Silently in the headlines, the bell began to toll. When the first reports of immune deficiency surfaced in 1981, among a small group of gay men in Los Angeles, it was believed to be a result of behavior unique to homosexuals. But all that changed when similar conditions started showing up in IV drug users and hemophiliacs. That set off an alarm. What had been called gay-related immune deficiency now appeared to be an infectious disease that might spread throughout the entire population. This threat of a deadly blood disease being spread by sexual contact was sensationalized by the media and enraged gay activists who demanded action from the government. Public health officials issued strong warnings that this new immune disease could be acquired sexually by anyone. Suddenly, immune suppression common to drug addicts, homosexuals, advanced TB patients, and scores of other diseases became linked together in a microbiological search for a common cause. Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, or AIDS, was born. And as the bathhouses in San Francisco closed and the fear of AIDS spread, the U.S. Department of Health came under heavy fire to find the cause and remedy quickly. The public was willing to believe science could provide a quick fix. So the funding began to roll in, and the huge army of virus hunters who had been unemployed after the unsuccessful virus cancer program went back to work. They now turned their full attention towards finding the cause and cure for AIDS. In the beginning, a number of different causes were suggested. Drugs like heroin, cocaine, poppers, barbiturates, and amphetamines had all been observed to harm the immune system. Also, malnutrition, repeated infection, overuse of antibiotics, and stress. But these behavior-related causes were politically incorrect with gay activists who wanted to distance themselves from the idea that AIDS might be self-inflicted. And government-funded research programs needed money and promised results. So, the decision was made politically to abandon the behavior AIDS model for the infectious epidemic model, and the virus hunters pressed on, self-convinced that AIDS could be stopped by a vaccine or a treatment. Two of these were Robert Gallo from the National Cancer Institute and Max Essex from Harvard, who had made public speculations by 1982 that AIDS might be caused by a retrovirus. Gallo's earlier research with retroviruses in the cancer program had been a failure. None of the viruses he studied could be directly linked to the cause of a disease, and his research yielded no benefit to the patient whatsoever. But one virus, HTLV-3, got Gallo's full attention. It was this virus, or as Gallo claimed, a variant of it, that would become the virus that causes AIDS.
Yes! Fight back! Fight back! Fight back!
Riding the whirlwind of public demand, Gallo made his move. On April 23, 1984, Secretary of Health and Human Services Margaret Heckler and Robert Gallo called a press conference together that would involve the United States Department of Health in what critics claim would become the biggest medical scientific blunder of all time.
First, the probable cause of AIDS has been found, a variant of a known human cancer virus called HTLV-3.
With HTLV-3, Gallo's white elephant virus program made the jump from the cause of cancer to become the cause of AIDS and the target of billions of dollars in research funds. Simultaneously, as the press conference was going on, the blood test used to detect HIV was being patented, which would earn the U.S. Department of Health over $100 million a year and large financial kickbacks to Robert Gallo. The AIDS industry was born, and the U.S. government was now fully invested. Naively, Secretary Heckler predicted that a vaccine would be ready for testing by 1986.
We hope to have such a vaccine ready for testing in approximately 2 years.
For the moment, everyone was happy about this discovery of the probable cause of AIDS. Gay activists were satisfied that the government was finally doing something. But the public was not aware that Gallo had bypassed a major checkpoint before making his announcement. He had not submitted his test results to other scientists for peer review. No one had a chance to critique or verify his claim, and his test results were not published in Science magazine until 1 week after the press conference. This was a dangerous violation of scientific protocol. Suddenly, a challenge to Gallo's ethics emerged, which would become an international scandal. The Institut Pasteur in Paris claimed that Gallo's AIDS virus was identical to LAV, a virus Dr. Luc Montagnier had sent Gallo's lab 6 months before the press conference. The French were outraged and filed an international lawsuit against the U.S. Health Department on grounds that Gallo had pirated their discovery. The entire incident was embarrassing to the United States and had to be resolved diplomatically by President Reagan and Prime Minister Jacques Chirac of France. With this arrangement to split the profits made on the HIV blood test, the virus was given a new international name, the Human Immunodeficiency Virus, or HIV. Despite questions of Gallo's character and ethics, HIV had now gained international acceptance. But when Gallo's HIV results were finally published in Science magazine, only 44 of 93 AIDS patients he tested, that's less than half, had the virus. Yet Gallo claimed that in further studies he could find HIV in up to 90% of those he tested. As other virologists reproduced Gallo's research, they found similar correlations between HIV and AIDS patients. This high correlation seemed convincing to everyone that HIV must have something to do with causing AIDS. Everyone, that is, except Dr. Peter Duesberg. At the University of California in Berkeley, Duesberg became a world-renowned retrovirologist in the cancer program and the first man to map the genetic structure of retroviruses like HIV back in 1970. His honors include membership in the National Academy of Sciences due to his discovery of cancer-causing genes. Having researched retroviruses for over 30 years, some have called him the world's foremost expert in retrovirology. Dr. Duesberg was somewhat skeptical of Gallo's AIDS virus announcement.
I wasn't madly impressed by it, because what else would you expect from a person like Gallo, who had studied retroviruses all his life, that he would say retrovirus is causing AIDS? That seemed to me the first coincidence that made me wonder whether that was an authentic claim, or going to be an authentic claim. But I would say it was not a surprise that he would say that. He said it before, that it would cause leukemia or things like Alzheimer's disease, neurological diseases, and it failed. So I was not too impressed that this was going to be a winner now. And it would have been for the first time that a retrovirus would have been pinned down as a cause of a human disease, or even a disease in wild animals.
For 18 months, Peter Duesberg studied every scientific publication on HIV and AIDS he could get a hold of. When he finally published his observations in Cancer Research in 1987, he stood alone against the tide of popular opinion and the government-funded AIDS industry. His position has become well known. He argues that HIV is not causing AIDS. It's a harmless passenger virus that has lived in humans for centuries without causing diseases. He believes AIDS is the result of other non-infectious factors like drug use. And ironically enough, AZT, the highly toxic medication prescribed to treat AIDS patients, actually does what the virus cannot, that is, causes AIDS itself. Though Dr. Duesberg's arguments were ridiculed by many and ignored by most, many of his colleagues studied his research and came to the same conclusion. Something is terribly wrong with the war on AIDS. Dr. Richard Stroman recalls the impact of Duesberg's arguments in Cancer Research.
It was a remarkable review, and it raised the fundamental issues about viruses as a cause of both cancer and immunosuppression, basic questions that haven't been really responded to in any meaningful way in the almost 10 years since that paper was published.
Soon other top scientists joined Duesberg and Stroman in questioning the HIV hypothesis also. Nobel Prize winners Dr. Walter Gilbert of Harvard and Kary Mullis, who invented the PCR. Dr. Charles Thomas, a former Harvard professor, organized a consortium of 12 signatories to address the issue. They would in time become the Group for Scientific Reappraisal of the HIV/AIDS hypothesis.
We started out by writing a letter to Nature calling for a reappraisal of the evidence for and against the hypothesis that HIV did in fact do all these things. And there were about 10 or 12 signatories to this letter, and it was rejected, even though many of the signers of the letter were certainly reputable people. We tried Nature magazine, and it was ignored. And then we tried the New England Journal, JAMA, and so forth, and Lancet. In each case, we were rejected. They would not publish this letter. It was only 4 sentences long. It read, "It is widely believed by the general public that a retrovirus called HIV causes a group of diseases called AIDS. Many biomedical scientists now question this hypothesis. We propose a thorough reappraisal of the existing evidence for and against this hypothesis be conducted by a suitable independent group. We further propose that critical epidemiological studies be devised and undertaken." Now, that is certainly hardly a bomb-throwing letter, but nonetheless, they would have none of it. And being rejected made us angry, so we decided to extend the list of signatories. So it jumped to 30, and then to 50, and then to 100. And then by 1994, up to 600, 188 of whom have advanced degrees. We publish a newsletter. We have a website. So it's a fairly large organization now.
Though the scientific establishment has continually ignored Duesberg and the Group for Reappraisal, some individuals are having second thoughts. At the San Francisco International AIDS Conference in 1990, Dr. Luc Montagnier, who discovered the virus originally 6 months before Gallo's claim, made a startling statement. HIV might be harmless. Against his own interest, Montagnier's statement should have been earth-shaking, but the conventioneers paid it little attention and went right on talking about new antiviral drug treatments. Why is the scientific community ignoring the dangerous ramifications of this essential question about the cause of AIDS? Do we have an answer?
Yes, in retrospect, we certainly do. Too many people are making too much money out of it. And money is much stronger than truth.
The correlation between AIDS and skyrocketing drug use is astounding. And unlike HIV, we have a good idea of how drugs suppress the immune system.
Well, how does smoking cause emphysema? How does alcoholism cause liver cirrhosis? That is something that has been described in the literature. It's chemistry. You know? Chemicals have their price. You can't expect to take chemical at a dose that gets you so high that you don't sleep anymore, you don't want to eat anymore, and you have 10 or 20 sex partners per night, to expect to be totally inconsequential for your health. If you do so much chemistry, put you so much chemistry in your body and do it with your body, you cannot expect that this has no consequences. It's like hoping that you can drive an American freeway car designed to go 60 miles an hour and 160 miles and expect it to run just as long as the company has promised it would last.
Though there are no government-funded studies that examine the long-term effects of drug use in this war on AIDS, the medical literature is full of cases of AIDS-like symptoms among drug addicts. Since 1909, we've observed the horrendous effects of heroin, morphine, speed, cocaine, and other injected drugs on the immune system. Today, thousands of American junkies who are not infected with HIV are losing the same CD4 T cells and getting the same diseases as AIDS patients. How has the war on AIDS addressed this issue? We've passed out clean needles and told addicts to avoid getting HIV. IV drug users comprise over 32% of all U.S. AIDS cases. Approximately 62% of all the women with AIDS are IV drug users, and 70% of the babies born with AIDS are born to mothers addicted to drugs. But the largest risk group is male homosexuals. Well over half, that's 60% of all AIDS patients, are gay men. What is causing AIDS in homosexuals, and are they all at risk? Here again, Peter Duesberg argues that AIDS is not infectious and is really the result of drugs used by many men in the fast-track gay lifestyle. Surveys conducted by the CDC show that gays often indulge in a high amount of recreational drug use, including many of the drugs known to be immunosuppressive in drug addicts. But one drug that was available legally, nitrite inhalants, commonly known as poppers, are used extensively. Poppers are believed to be the direct cause of Kaposi sarcoma, a rare form of skin cancer that afflicts the nose, throat, lungs, and skin. Kaposi sarcoma has been an indicator disease of AIDS, but it is often found in gay men who are not infected with HIV. In a study published by Toby Eisenstein, rodents showed a mediated dose response in immune suppression after being exposed to nitrites found in poppers.
Oh, I think that's very revealing. It showed that NO, nitric oxide radical, is terribly immunosuppressive. But interestingly enough, all of the literature on NO, and I follow it rather carefully by computer, never mentions amyl or butyl nitrite, never mentions the word poppers. It's as almost these two worlds are living side by side, but are not talking to each other.
AIDS patients have multiple infections of gonorrhea, syphilis, hepatitis, herpes, cytomegalovirus, and other diseases. To combat these repeated infections, homosexuals often take huge amounts of antibiotics during bathhouse visits, along with other drugs. These antibiotic overdoses also wear down the immune system. There's no doubt that homosexuals are contracting many of these opportunistic AIDS diseases sexually. But is this the cause of AIDS? Or simply put, are gays getting AIDS because of homosexual behavior? Or is it caused by drugs used commonly in connection with the gay lifestyle? Peter Duesberg points out that the number of homosexuals getting AIDS amounts to only a very small percentage of the entire gay population.
So we're talking about a very small percentage of the homosexual population that is practicing this lifestyle, taking these drugs for sex. Those are the ones who are at risk. not homosexuals. Homosexuals, again, are as old as mankind is. Michelangelo was, Socrates was, Tchaikovsky was, and they all lived without AIDS, normal lives.
Duisberg argues that if the war on AIDS focused upon drugs used in the gay lifestyle instead of HIV, we could save thousands of lives.
We have over 100,000 studies on HIV and AIDS. And there isn't one, there is not uno, epidemiological study that has shown that a group of, I go as low as 10 or 20 men, homosexuals, heterosexual, doesn't matter, HIV positive, but not using poppers, not using cocaine, not using heroin, and not using AZT, ever gets AIDS. Ever gets Kaposi sarcoma, tuberculosis, dementia, or diarrhea at the age of 25 or 35, where these men die when they take the drugs and have HIV. Why is there no such study? I think the answer is very simple, because HIV doesn't do it. It's the drugs that are doing it.
In 1987, the war on AIDS took another drastic turn for the worse. AZT, a toxic chemotherapy deemed too poisonous for cancer treatment, was approved to treat symptomatic and asymptomatic HIV patients in an attempt to kill the virus that causes AIDS. AZT is a DNA chain terminator, a poison designed to randomly destroy the DNA synthesis of reproducing cells. It was initially developed to treat leukemia victims, but after animal testing, the FDA determined that it was too toxic for use in human beings and banned it. But in 1987, when the AIDS scare hit its height, the FDA was pressured into approving the drug for use for the first time in human beings, even for people who were healthy and showed no sign of AIDS. AZT is highly mutagenic, meaning that it destroys the genes in cells and has been shown to cause cancer in rodents. It targets the bone marrow, where B lymphocyte blood cells are being made. These are the very cells an AIDS patient needs most for immunity. AZT destroys randomly bone marrow, kidneys, liver, intestines, muscle tissue, the brain, and central nervous system. Peter Duisberg claims AZT actually causes AIDS itself.
AZT, yes, does directly causing AIDS defining diseases. You know, AIDS is a lot of things, but it doesn't cause Kaposi sarcoma, I think, but it does cause immunodeficiency. It was designed to do that. It was designed to kill human cells. In fact, the manufacturer says that specifically that it can cause AIDS-like diseases. The manufacturer, that is Burroughs Wellcome, says it is often difficult to distinguish adverse events possibly associated with pseudobudin or pseudobudin administration, which is AZT, from underlying signs of HIV disease. In other words, even they acknowledge, not just Duisberg, that AZT causes AIDS or AIDS-defining diseases.
In his book, Poison by Prescription, journalist John Lawrenson explains how AZT tests conducted by the FDA and Burroughs Wellcome, the manufacturer, were scientifically sloppy and outright fraudulent. During the experiments, patients taking AZT became anemic, suffered low white blood cell counts accompanied by vomiting. Over half had to have blood transfusions. 20% were transfused several times. Though both doctors and patients were not supposed to know who was getting AZT and who was getting the placebo, it became obvious halfway through the test who was on AZT. Out of fear and desperation, many of those being tested traded drugs. The test was terminated early, and because of what appeared to be benefits from using AZT, the patients who were taking the placebo were now also given AZT. This made long-term follow-up of AZT's toxic effects impossible. Despite a warning by FDA toxicology analyst Harvey Chernoff that AZT not be approved, the FDA was pressured by AIDS activist organizations to lift the ban, and hundreds of thousands of people began taking AZT, even though AZT cannot cure AIDS and is only supposed to slow down the progression. But the logic behind AZT treatment is flawed, even if one believes HIV causes AIDS, because HIV only infects about 1 T cell in 1,000. 999 healthy T cells must die to kill the 1 cell that is infected, and this can only happen early on before HIV becomes dormant and is still making DNA. Yet AIDS patients are given AZT for months, on into years, randomly destroying DNA in all parts of the body. AZT is expensive and costs between $8,000 and $12,000 a year, most of which is paid for directly or indirectly by the taxpayer. Burroughs Wellcome, now Glaxo Wellcome, the manufacturer, has generated sales over $1 billion a year with AZT. Because of rules allowed by the FDA, a bottle of AZT that costs about $5 to make can be sold for over $500 as a prescription, and much of this markup is being subsidized by the taxpayer.
The treatment causes a very similar condition we would expect from an AIDS patient. That's why nobody noticed that there was something wrong with the treatment.
I remember in 1992, after I first tested positive, I became involved in an organization called Women at Risk. There were 11 of us at the time on the board and involved in the group. All of us except 3 were on the medications. In the year and a half that I was involved with Women at Risk, every single woman in that organization on the drugs died. Every single one, except the 3 of us who weren't taking them.
We weren't just given handfuls of AZT, we demanded it.
AZT, where is your humanity?
We considered the FDA not giving us these things as being anti-gay instead of being responsible. And so we went and we lobbied and we pushed for all these things, and we didn't think clearly about what it was we were asking for. It's like that saying, be careful what you ask for, it may come to pass.
That's the very reason why everybody believed HIV is a deadly virus, because the HIV-positive patients at that time got a deadly treatment.
Despite the billions spent on the drug, tens of thousands of people with AIDS have died. And now a growing number of studies are questioning the drug's usefulness.
We just decided between ourselves in November to write to Peter Duisberg and say, sorry to bother you. Are you for real? And if Lindsay were your daughter, what would you do? On November 11th, we got a big package, and he said, you must take your daughter off AZT immediately or she will die from it like Kimberly McGillis.
That is AIDS by prescription. You get immunodeficiency and you die from the tox. That is AIDS by prescription.
When AZT became widely available in 1985 and 1986, I cautioned my patients not to jump on the bandwagon and start being treated. I didn't want to see my community poisoned by an ineffective therapy.
I think in retrospect, the dose that we started with AZT was a dangerous and poorly tolerated dose.
Nobody wants to realize what was the real effect of this overtreatment. That means that we killed a whole generation of AIDS patients. I have patients tested in 1985. They were all advised to take treatment, but they declined the treatment for different reasons. Because they didn't want to take toxic drugs because they were feeling well at that time.
And how are they doing today?
They are still living.
Healthy?
Yeah.
Once we came to the conclusion that this was the drug that was causing this problem, irregardless of what the HIV was going to do, she was going to come off the drug no matter what.
If taking her off the drugs meant that she could sleep through the night and be happy for 6 months, that would be worth it, rather than live in agony for 2 years or 12 months.
You hear a lot of doctors, you hear a lot of educators in AIDS, you hear a lot of people talk about it is probably the drugs that are going to kill us before the disease does.
What are the drugs doing to the bodies? They're putting the bodies into coffins.
If someone's going to be giving me a diagnosis of certain death in 5 to 7 years, I want scientific proof. This isn't a religion.
My interest in questioning and breaking and exploring does HIV cause AIDS is an instinct to liberate people from a death sentence that isn't theirs to carry.
After we took Lindsay off AZT, her weight did go up.
Within a couple of days, the leg cramps went away.
And her physical body seemed to be doing pretty well, but it was like she was disturbed. She was agitated very easily.
Her lifespan changed all the time after she got to be 2 years old, and then she'd only live to be 5.
When she got to be a little older, then they said, oh, she might live to be 7.
Yeah. But definitely wouldn't live into double digits, and that's just was our life then.
Although Lindsay was on AZT for 22 months, she made a full recovery from the pernicious side effects. Lindsay will be 19 in October of 2009.
Because it's been surrounded from day one with so much emotion, so much fear, so much psychology, so much drama, very few people are capable of looking at AIDS logically.
We can be exposed to HIV many times without being chronically infected. Our immune system could get rid of the virus within a few weeks if you have a good immune system.
If you have a good immune system, then your body can naturally get rid of HIV.
Yes.
If you take a poor African who's been infected and you build up their immune system, is it possible for them to also naturally get rid of it?
I would think so.
It's very easy to get people to think the right thing if you get the right on the tablet the first time. But once something's on the tablet and you gotta erase it and put something else, it's very hard to get people to think differently.
You talked about oxidative stress earlier. Is treating oxidative stress one of the best ways to deal with the African AIDS epidemic?
I think this is one way to approach, to decrease the rate of transmission, because I believe HIV, we can be exposed to HIV many times without being chronically infected. Our immune system could get rid of the virus within a few weeks if you have a good immune system. And this is the problem also of African people. Their nutrition is not very equilibrated. They are in oxidative stress, even they are not infected with HIV. So their immune system doesn't work well already. So it's prone, it can, allow HIV to get in and persist. So there are many ways which are not the vaccine, the magic name, the vaccine. Many ways to decrease the transmission just by simple measures of nutrition, giving antioxidants, proper antioxidants, hygiene measures, fighting the other infections. So they are not spectacular, but they could, decrease very well the epidemic to the level they are in Occidental countries, Western countries.
If you have a good immune system, then your body can naturally get rid of HIV?
Yes.
Oh, interesting. Do you think we should have more of a push for antioxidants and things of that nature in Africa than antiretrovirals?
We should push for more, a combination of measures, antioxidant by nutrition, advice and nutrition, fighting other infections, malaria, tuberculosis, parasitosis. Most children have worms. Education, of course, genital hygiene for women and men also. Very simple measure, which not very expensive, but which could do a lot. And this is my worry about the many spectacular action. Of course, there are global funds so to buy drugs and so on, Bill Gates and so on, for the vaccine. But those kind of measures are not very well funded, not funded at all, or they are, it really depends on the local government to take conscious of this, but local government, they take advice of the scientific advisor from the international institutions, and they don't get this kind of advice very often.
There's no money in nutrition, right? There's no profit.
There's no profit, yes. The water is important. Water is key.
Now, one thing you said, you were talking about the fact that if you have a built immune system, it is possible to get rid of HIV naturally. If you take a poor African who's been infected and you build up their immune system, is it possible for them to also naturally get rid of it?
I would think so.
Okay, that's an important.
It's
point.
Important knowledge which is completely neglected. People always think of drugs and vaccine. So this is a message which may be different from from what you heard before, no?
The closing?
No, but yes, my message is different from what you heard from Fauci or...
Yes, it's a little different.
It's a little different.